Hello and welcome everybody back to the Maritime CEO Leader Series powered by the Ocean Technologies Group. It's our chance to sit down for a natter with some of the most interesting people in shipping and check out their houses behind them. So today we are in Hong Kong and we're in the house of Will Fairclough, Managing Director of Kwong. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today. Let's kick it off. This is a question that I'm asking everyone to begin with, and I'm sure as this sort of season develops, we'll be spreading out the questions, but I think it's a relevant one. And you've got a diverse fleet, you've got a lot of crew. So what's impressed you most about shipping's reaction to the coronavirus?
It's a good question. Of course, ships are still moving, and I think if we look at what's happened and is going to happen in the next 2 to 3 months to the global airline industry, where you've seen almost the entire equity base, the entire global airline fleet wiped out, I think there's something about the good old handy-sized bulk carrier that's plugging away the nuts and bolts of the world economy and still just about earning its keep. And I think if you reflect over the last decade, maybe the last 20 years, the transport analysts that have generally covered shipping and airlines and other aspects, ports often as well, the airline industry was obviously the growth, to some extent, the slightly sexier end. And shipping, I think, has been, to some extent, the very opposite end of that spectrum. And I think it adds a certain luster, I think, to the bottom common denominator of world trade, which is the ships plying their trade, and the fact that whilst the world has collapsed and there's been a financial crisis that's triggered by what's happened, that actually these ships are plugging away and still earning, in historical terms, not a brilliant return, but they are paying their way. And I think in the context of what's happened in some of the other industries, and I think particularly of the airline industry and the cruise industry and hotel and restaurant industries, who've obviously been devastatingly hard hit, particularly in the transport sector, as it might be sort of reflected on by investors. I think it does highlight what I think people have been saying, that yes, especially on the small bulk carrier side, it hasn't been, the returns haven't been spectacular, certainly in the last 10 years, but there's a solidity there that I think has been highlighted by what's happened now. The tanker industry is something quite different, and maybe we'll talk about that separately, because that's almost uncorrelated and unconnected to what's happened, the extraordinary 3 months that we've seen in my career. So I think, that's probably what my reflection is initially.
And, as this crisis has broken out, there's been all sorts of regulatory things that perhaps we've never had to think about before. Obviously, crew change, one of them. There's still quite a lot that needs to be ironed out in the wake of this outbreak. For you, what's been some of the big kind of regulatory headaches that, perhaps you had thought about before, but now you can see that they really, we need to be talking about them, we need to fix them as the crisis recedes for the next time, or whenever there is something similar like this?
Yeah, I think crew changes, you've obviously hit the nail on the head there. There have been some challenges for shipyards, given force majeures have been declared, and there's certainly certain regulatory deadlines that we're getting slightly close to. And I think nobody expected and factored in the extent to what we've seen. I think specifically, if you think of trying to buy or sell a ship now, and you compare it maybe to the UK property market, which has been put on hold, and the government advice has been, right, there's no buying or selling, no exchanging. Sale and purchase transactions in shipping have actually still gone ahead, and they've gone ahead via electronic means, and that has, believe me, involved a hell of a lot of adapting on the hoof to the change in circumstances. And I think it has reflected that, can-do attitude and that obsession with trying to find a way to get things done, despite obvious restrictions with travel. And I think crew changes is an altogether different thing. And for Kwong, we have predominantly Chinese crew, almost exclusively Chinese crew. And of course, at the beginning of the crisis, that was a huge disadvantage, it seemed. But there were some dispensation if you had certain crew members reaching the top end of their contracts. But actually, ironically, now having Chinese crews become very much an advantage now, because crew changes within China are very much possible. And with most ships going to China and with most of our crew being Chinese, we are now, with ships going to China, able to do crew changes, which is not possible with a lot of other crews and not possible with the large majority of the global fleet. So I think that's a massive challenge. But of course, there's a huge human element there to ensuring that the crew, there's one thing just to ask for crew to stay on the ship. But if you've got crew members who've been looking forward to the end of their contract, there's a real, I think, emphasis within the industry to ensure that level of communication between ship owner in the office and the crew members who are reading the news, as we all are, and they have their own fears and fears for their family, are communicated in a responsible and sympathetic way.
Let's turn then to tankers. You and I have been in this crazy industry for 20 years, both of us, I think. And I would say that, yes, there was the dry bulk run of 2008 that we'll never forget. But what's been going on with tankers since, if we go back to, say, last September and the sanctions around that time, but then this year as well, the sheer volatility, the crazy times. How long does this bull run last? How the heck can we explain it? Any reflections on the OPEC cuts? Tell me your thoughts.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, I think, Sam, given that we sit here on Good Friday, and of course the OPEC cuts were announced yesterday evening in Hong Kong time, Thursday evening. And so when does the bull run end? I think that was your question. And it may have already ended. And we're going to obviously have to get to the office on Tuesday for most people and see what the reaction is. Funny enough, when I read the news this morning of the initial headline, which is this 10 million barrel per day cut, I was disappointed with my ship owning hat on, tanker owning hat on. And yet the reaction has actually been relatively positive, much more positive than I anticipated. I think the clarity that's given to the market has actually led to tanker stocks rallying, I think. So I read, and it's very new. I haven't read a single research piece, so I'm probably ill-informed and talking on the hoof with gut feeling. But I think sometimes those first, we may look at it in a week and grimace somewhat, but sometimes those initial reactions are quite telling, I think. And my view is that actually it underlines the extent to which what started off as a supply shock has well and truly become entrenched as a demand shock. And the chain of events is so extraordinary that you really couldn't make it up. But I think if we look at early March, when that surprise announcement came that there hadn't been a cut, and in fact Saudi Arabia were going to produce 2 or 3 million barrels a day extra, that was purely a supply shock, and the tanker market obviously responded in an extraordinary way. And now the fact that they're talking about a 10 million barrel per day cut, and the tanker stocks rallied, and that people are saying, well, at least it gives us clarity, and even with 10 million barrels per day less, there's still going to be the need for storage, emphasizes the extent to which this has obviously become purely a demand shock. And I think there have been different analysts who beforehand had different views on the extent to which something like a 10 million barrel per day cut would actually affect the market. And I think in extreme cases, I read that it may push VLCC earnings back towards break even or even sort of OPEX levels. Whereas if there hadn't been a cut, we were looking at market established at between $80,000 and $100,000 a day. And I think now people's thinking have matured over the week, and we got used to the idea that the cut was probably going to happen, that it was probably unsustainable as it was. I think it's really sunk in the extent to which actually there's still too much oil for the demand situation as it is today, and storage is what's going to underpin the market. So I think we'll have a period of volatility for the first few trading days once we're back, and it will be interesting to see where the market settles, and I have no idea where that exactly will be. But people who've looked at a lot more data than I have and probably have a better idea of these things actually their views are relatively optimistic that it'll settle at a good level initially. And I think the big question mark is then all these questions that the rest of the world are also asking, not just within the tanker industry. When does the economy return to something approaching normality? When does air travel and the consumption of the oil start to return?
Yes, totally. Now, I think you're aware of your personal carbon footprint. So I'm asking you this: how great a change to our daily business lives do you think will happen after coronavirus? You know, here we are talking by video. Everyone's kind of getting used to that. Are we going to start referring to dates as BC and AC? Is this year zero? Is it before Corona, after Corona? How much of a change will it be? Or we just go back to normal within a few months and it's all same.
I think the financial crisis still burns brightly in all of our minds, and we talk about before the financial crisis and after the financial crisis in 2008, and there's the Asian financial crisis, and this will certainly go down as, you know, at least in that scale. I think the scale of the impact it's had on daily lives has been compared to, you know, in the Western world, Second World War is the last time we saw such an impact on day-to-day lives, the extent to which the world assumed that we needed carbon-intensive travel to sustain the economy and that it was something that wasn't going to go away. It has been shown that that can stop in a couple of weeks. And I don't think anyone anywhere believed that was possible. It's shown it can be done. And so I think once that enters the human psyche, it does alter people's perception of what is necessary. And so I think it could fast forward a lot of trends. I think when you're in a situation as we are now, often the tendency is to assume maybe that it'll change forever, but to some extent there will be a return. But I think that we may have hit the extreme in terms of the extent to which people feel the need to jump on an aeroplane simply to attend a meeting. And I think that there's obviously an economic consideration there. There's an environmental consideration there. And I think the whole environmental debate, and I think within shipping, we were very much, if we managed to get past the scrubber debate in the last 6 to 12 months, focused on what's next, that's been a big part of a lot of what we're talking about. And I think the message that we've made, and we're certainly not alone, but ship owners generally, is there is a need for the next phase of technology. The current technology, the next cab off the rank, if you like, is certainly LNG. But the investment has to be underpinned by commitment from the end users. And ultimately, that cost has to flow through to the consumer, and that is to society at large. And what this may do is alter society's view on whether or not they're willing to pay for it. And it may mean that they are now far more willing to pay for it than they were before. And the fact that there's a certain urgency to move to the next phase of addressing the environmental issue. And so this may end up getting within to the psyche of the decision makers. And I think it's now far more easier to illustrate as a ship owner that you can't just go and build a whole lot of ships that you think might be more environmentally friendly, because ultimately, actually, if you look at it in very basic terms, ship owners are often not the people buying the fuel. You know, they will supply the equipment, but ultimately it's normally the charterer and then the shippers who are funding the fuel. Ultimately, the consumer, and that is society at large. And if society at large is willing to say, look, you've got to do what needs to be done, and if that's an additional cost on the transportation of everything that we move by sea, then so be it. And if that is the case, then this could lead to the next generation of ships and addressing what is obviously has been on the mind of the shipping industry for some time. So to that extent, yes, I think this will always be some sort of flag in the ground, and we will view before and after. But whether or not things completely change forever, I wouldn't bet on it, because it's often in the short term that may be the case, but reversion to the mean is also a very powerful force.
Totally agreed. Right, we're going to finish with some, though you're not really in lockdown, I'm going to give you lockdown cultural questions. Best book to read during a lockdown, and if you had to, best TV binging if you had to, give some advice.
A fantastic book I've read recently is a book called Rebel Ideas by Matthew Syed, who is a Times columnist and a brilliant, brilliant author. And it's something speaks very much to what I think we're very lucky about in shipping, which is that idea of cognitive diversity. And Rebel Ideas is actually a very scientific look at the benefits of cognitive diversity. And what we have in shipping with so many different nationalities, so many different cultures coming and working together, and I'm a prime example of that, is you get better outcomes because you get different perspectives and different points of views. And I think for anybody within shipping, it's a fascinating book because it tries to break down and so much of what we actually are so lucky about within shipping, that we work with a truly global audience and we work with so many colleagues who look at life in a completely different way, but we actually all have the same end goal. And so I've hugely enjoyed reading that, and that's been very much thanks to the fact that I'm not going out very much and there's plenty of time to read books. And for television, well, it's a good question. I've been binge watching The Ozarks on Netflix, and that's an extremely amusing, entertaining series. And there was also a slightly lesser known thing I dug out the other day called John Adams, which is Paul Giamatti, who is the guy from Billions, and he plays John Adams, second president of the United States, and it's a very well dramatized, high budget production about his life, and it taught me a lot about American history that I probably should have known that I didn't. And it's a 4 or 5 part series, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well, look, thank you very much indeed for your time, Will, and you get back to your family, and we will all be back next week. In the meantime, everybody stay sane and sanitized. Thank you.